While Panzer tanks crossed the frozen steppe and Stukas tore through the skies, it was a rifle from 1891, obsolete, heavy, brutal, that broke the backbone of the Wehrmacht. The Mosin Nagant didn't win through technology. It won through Russian stubbornness and the blood of millions. This is the story of the most unlikely weapon that ever decided the fate of the world. The year was 1891. Imperial Russia faced a crisis that would determine its survival as a great power. The recent Russo-Turkish War had exposed a humiliating truth. Russian soldiers carried outdated single-shot rifles while their enemies wielded modern repeating weapons. On the battlefields of the Balkans, Russian infantry had been systematically outgunned, their Berdan rifles requiring a reload after every shot, while Turkish troops fired multiple rounds in rapid succession. Tsar Alexander III understood what military historians would later confirm. Wars were no longer won by courage alone. They were won by firepower, by the ability to deliver more bullets downrange faster than your enemy. The Russian Empire needed a modern rifle, and it needed one immediately. The geopolitical landscape of late 19th century Europe demanded this transformation. Germany was industrializing at a terrifying pace, its Mauser rifles already legendary for their precision and reliability. France had adopted the revolutionary Liebel rifle, the first military weapon to use smokeless powder. Austria-Hungary, Britain, and even smaller nations were modernizing their arsenals. Russia, vast and powerful but technologically backward, risked becoming irrelevant on the modern battlefield. The Russian Ministry of War issued a challenge to the world's gun designers. Create a rifle that could match or exceed anything in European arsenals, but do it cheaply enough to arm millions of peasant soldiers across the largest empire on Earth. It needed to be rugged enough to survive Siberian winters and Central Asian deserts, simple enough that conscripts with minimal training could maintain it, powerful enough to stop a charging enemy at distance. Two men answered that call, though they would never meet as friends. Captain Sergei Ivanovich Mosin was a career artillery officer and weapons designer at the Tula Arsenal, Russia's oldest firearms factory. His design featured a revolutionary internal magazine that kept cartridges protected from mud and debris, a crucial advantage in the harsh conditions Russian soldiers faced. Mosin's rifle was distinctly Russian in character, practical, sturdy, designed for mass production rather than elegance. Across Europe, the Belgian brothers Émile and Léon Nagant had built a reputation as innovative firearms designers. Their submission to the Russian trials featured a superior feeding system and a clip-loading mechanism that would allow faster reloading in combat. The Nagant design was more refined, more Western in its engineering philosophy. The Russian military commission faced a dilemma. Mosin's rifle was cheaper to produce and better suited to Russian manufacturing capabilities. The Nagant design had technical advantages that couldn't be ignored. In a decision that would echo through history, they combined elements of both designs, creating a hybrid weapon. According to official records, the rifle was designated the three-line rifle M1891 in Russian service. The three lines referred to the caliber measurement system used in Imperial Russia, equivalent to 7.62 mm. But soldiers and historians would know it by the names of its creators. The Mosin Nagant. Mosin received most of the credit in Russia, his name appearing first in common usage. The Nagant brothers received compensation for their contributions, but would always be secondary in the rifle's legacy. This arrangement created lasting controversy. Belgian historians claim the Nagants deserved equal recognition. Russian historians counter that Mosin's fundamental design formed the rifle's core. The truth, as often happens in history, was more complex than either side wanted to admit. The Mosin Nagant that emerged from Tula Arsenal in 1891 was not a beautiful weapon. It was long, nearly 4 feet from stock to bayonet lug. It was heavy, over 9 pounds unloaded. Its bolt action was stiff, requiring significant force to operate. Everything about it spoke of a design philosophy that prioritized durability over comfort, function over form. But what it lacked in elegance, it made up for in brutal effectiveness. The rifle fired the 7.62 SM54mm cartridge, one of the most powerful rounds in military service. That small R stood for rimmed, an older design that most nations were abandoning, but the Russians had their reasons. Rimmed cartridges were easier to manufacture with the industrial capabilities available in 1891. They fed more reliably in cold weather when frost could cause tighter tolerances to bind. The internal magazine held 5 rounds, loaded through the top using a stripper clip. Unlike external magazines that could be damaged or lost, the Mosin's magazine was integral to the rifle, protected by the wooden stock. A soldier could load all 5 rounds in seconds, snap the bolt closed, and have a weapon ready for sustained fire. The magazine spring was simple, robust, nearly impossible to break even with rough handling. The bolt system itself was a masterpiece of practical engineering. Where many rifles of the era used complex locking systems, the Mosin employed 2 massive locking lugs at the front of the bolt. When the soldier closed the bolt, these lugs rotated into corresponding recesses in the receiver, creating a seal strong enough to contain the enormous pressure of firing. It was crude by Western standards, but it worked. More importantly, it kept working when other rifles jammed or broke. The barrel was long, over 30 inches, giving the bullet maximum velocity and accuracy at range. Russian military doctrine emphasized long-range volley fire, soldiers shooting in coordinated volleys at enemy formations hundreds of yards away. The Mosin Nagant could reach out to 800 meters effectively, farther with skilled marksmen. Iron sights were simple but adequate, a post-front sight and a sliding rear notch adjustable for range. One feature set the Mosin apart from nearly every other military rifle of its era: the permanently attached bayonet. While most nations treated bayonets as accessories, something to fix to the rifle before a charge, Russian designers made the bayonet an integral part of the weapon. The rifle was sighted with the bayonet extended. Removing it actually changed the point of impact. This wasn't an oversight, it was intentional. Russian doctrine assumed the bayonet would always be fixed in combat. An enemy should never see a Russian soldier with an unadorned rifle. The wood stock was typically birch or other hardwoods, straight and functional. No checkering, no decorative touches, just solid wood to protect the metal and give the soldier something to hold. In winter, that wood could freeze until it burned exposed skin. In summer, it could swell with humidity. But it didn't break, didn't split, didn't fail. Weight was the rifle's greatest weakness and, paradoxically, one of its strengths. Yes, it was heavy compared to German Mausers or American Springfields. Soldiers cursed it during long marches. But in combat, that weight absorbed recoil, making follow-up shots faster and more accurate. It made the rifle deadly as a club in hand-to-hand fighting. And it gave the weapon a psychological presence. This was not a toy, but an instrument of war. Manufacturing tolerances were loose by Western standards. Parts from different rifles often weren't interchangeable without hand-fitting. But this flaw meant rifles could be produced quickly in factories with less sophisticated machinery. It meant partisan workshops could repair rifles with improvised parts. It meant the Mosin could be made by the millions, while German factories struggled to produce their more precise weapons in sufficient numbers. The Mosin Nagant first saw combat in 1904, 13 years after its adoption, on the frozen plains of Manchuria during the Russo-Japanese War. Russian soldiers, confident in their European superiority, marched into battle against an Asian enemy they assumed would be easily defeated. They were wrong. At the Battle of Port Arthur, Russian infantry armed with Mosin Nagant rifles faced Japanese troops carrying Arisaka rifles, themselves designed with Mauser influence. The rifles were roughly equivalent in capability, but the Japanese had superior training, better tactics, and modern artillery support. According to military records from the siege, Russian soldiers found their Mosins reliable in the brutal cold, but they found themselves systematically outmaneuvered and outfought. The siege lasted from August 1904 until January 1905. Russian defenders fired millions of rounds from their Mosin rifles, holding defensive positions against wave after wave of Japanese assaults. Witnesses described the constant crack of rifle fire, the mountains of spent brass casings, the bitter cold that made metal burn skin. The Mosin performed adequately in these conditions, but adequate wasn't enough to change the war's outcome. At Mukden in March 1905, the largest land battle fought between ironclad warships and modern repeating rifles, over 600,000 soldiers clashed across frozen fields. Russian infantry with their Mosins held defensive lines for weeks, but superior Japanese artillery and tactics eventually forced a retreat. Post-battle analysis by Russian military observers noted that the rifle itself wasn't the problem. Training, leadership, and logistics had failed. The war ended in humiliating defeat for Russia, but military analysts studying the conflict drew important conclusions about the Mosin Nagant. It functioned reliably in extreme cold where other weapons might fail. It was simple enough that conscript soldiers could maintain it under field conditions. Its power was adequate for modern warfare. The rifle had passed its first real test, even if the Russian army had not. When World War I erupted in August 1914, the Russian Empire mobilized millions of men, and most carried the Mosin Nagant. The rifle that had been designed for imperial expansion would now face the industrialized slaughter of the Western Front's eastern counterpart. On the Eastern Front, where battles sprawled across distances that dwarfed the trenches of France and Belgium, the Mosin proved its worth through sheer endurance. At Tannenberg in late August 1914, Russian Second Army soldiers fired their rifles until barrels glowed red, until ammunition ran out, until German encirclement made further resistance impossible. Over 170,000 Russian soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured, but their rifles kept firing until the end. The Battle of Lodz in November-December 1914 demonstrated both the rifle's capabilities and Russia's logistical nightmares. According to German accounts, Russian infantry delivered devastating rifle fire at ranges exceeding 600 meters, their Mosins proving accurate and powerful at distances where many armies would rely on machine guns. But ammunition shortages forced some units to ration cartridges, firing only at certain targets, making each shot count with terrible precision. In the forests of East Prussia, Russian soldiers found the Mosin's length became a liability in close-quarters forest fighting. The rifle was designed for open-field warfare, not the tangled woods where German infantry with shorter carbines could maneuver more easily. Russian casualties mounted as they struggled to bring their long rifles to bear in dense terrain. By 1915, Russia faced an ammunition crisis of catastrophic proportions. Factories couldn't produce cartridges fast enough to feed the millions of Mosins at the front. Soldiers were ordered to conserve ammunition, to fire only when they had clear targets. Some units received as few as 10 rounds per man per day. Witnesses reported seeing Russian soldiers charging Austrian and German positions with empty rifles, the bayonet their only weapon. The Brusilov offensive of 1916 represented the Mosin Nagant's greatest moment in the First World War. General Alexei Brusilov conceived a strategy of multiple breakthrough points, overwhelming Austro-Hungarian lines through coordinated infantry assaults supported by accurate rifle fire. From June through September 1916, Russian infantry armed with Mosins captured over 400,000 enemy soldiers and advanced up to 100 kilometers on some fronts. Austrian reports from the offensive described the terror of facing massed Russian rifle fire. Mosin Nagant rounds at 800 meters could penetrate Austrian body armor and wooden defensive structures. The distinctive crack of 7.62 xm 54 mm cartridges became the soundtrack of the Austrian army's near collapse. Only German reinforcements stabilized the front, and even then, Russian riflemen continued inflicting devastating casualties. But the offensive also revealed the Mosin's limitations in a modern industrial war. Russian factories still couldn't produce enough ammunition. Rifle barrels wore out from heavy firing without adequate replacements. The loose manufacturing tolerances that made production easy also meant accuracy degraded faster than with more precisely made weapons. By late 1916, many Russian soldiers carried rifles that were worn, damaged, or lacked essential components. The Russian Revolution of 1917 found the Mosin Nagant in the hands of revolutionaries and loyalists alike. In Petrograd, soldiers turned their rifles on the government they were supposed to defend. During the October Revolution, Bolshevik forces armed with Mosins stormed the Winter Palace. The same rifles that had fought for the Tsar now fought to destroy his empire. The Russian Civil War from 1918 to 1922 transformed the Mosin Nagant from an imperial weapon into a Soviet icon. In battles across the frozen vastness of Russia, Red Army soldiers, White Army forces, foreign interventionists, and partisan groups all wielded Mosins. It became the universal weapon of the Russian catastrophe, the rifle present at every massacre, every triumph, every desperate last stand. During this period, the Soviet government recognized they needed to modernize their rifle while maintaining production. Rifle production had collapsed during the Revolution and Civil War. Factories were damaged, skilled workers had fled or been killed, raw materials were scarce. Yet the Red Army desperately needed weapons. In 1930, the Soviets introduced the M9130, a modified version of the original Mosin Nagant. The changes were subtle but significant. A shorter barrel for easier handling, improved sights for better accuracy, and simplified production methods to increase output. The M9130 retained all the brutal reliability of the original while incorporating lessons from decades of combat experience. Soviet factories churned out M9130 rifles by the millions through the 1930s. Tula Arsenal, Izhevsk Arsenal, and other facilities operated around the clock, building an arsenal for the conflict Soviet leadership knew was coming. By 1941, the Red Army possessed over 5 million Mosin Nagant rifles in various configurations. It wouldn't be enough. June 22, 1941. Nazi Germany unleashed Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in human history. 3 million German soldiers, supported by thousands of tanks and aircraft, smashed into Soviet lines. The German military, Wehrmacht and SS, carried Karabiner 98K rifles, modern Mauser-designed weapons that many experts considered superior to the Mosin Nagant in every measurable way. On paper, the Germans should have won quickly. Their rifles were lighter, more accurate, better made. Their tactics were revolutionary, combining armor, infantry, and air power in devastating blitzkrieg operations. They had veterans hardened by victories across Europe. The Soviets had millions of barely trained conscripts carrying rifles older than their fathers. But paper doesn't account for Russian winter, or Soviet fanaticism, or the fact that the Mosin Nagant was designed for exactly this war. At the Battle of Moscow in December 1941, when temperatures plummeted to 40 degrees Celsius, German soldiers discovered that their superior weapons had a fatal flaw. They couldn't function in extreme cold. The Karabiner 98K's tighter tolerances meant ice and frost caused mechanisms to jam. Lubricants froze solid, bolts wouldn't cycle. German infantry found themselves in close combat with rifles that had become clubs. The Mosin Nagant kept firing. Its loose tolerances meant ice didn't bind the action. Soviet soldiers used minimal lubrication or no lubrication at all in extreme cold. The rifle didn't need it. The same flaw Western critics had mocked for 50 years became a life-or-death advantage. According to German after-action reports, Soviet infantry maintained effective rifle fire even in temperatures that rendered German weapons inoperable. Soviet soldiers wrapped in winter camouflage emerged from forests outside Moscow, their breath freezing in the air, their Mosins slung across their backs. They moved through snow that came to their waists, taking positions that German forces had thought impossible to defend. When they opened fire, the crack of Mosin rifles echoed across frozen fields. Germans fell, their superior weapons useless in their frozen hands. The siege of Leningrad from 1941 to 1944 became a testament to what the Mosin Nagant and Soviet determination could achieve. Surrounded, starving, bombarded daily by German artillery and aircraft, Leningrad's defenders held their positions. Soldiers fired Mosins from rubble-strewn buildings, from hastily dug trenches, from positions they knew they wouldn't survive. The rifles kept working even as their operators starved to death. Inside the city, workers at the remaining functional factories continued producing Mosin Nagant rifles and ammunition under German bombardment. According to Soviet records, Leningrad factories produced over 12,000 rifles during the siege, metal forged while workers collapsed from hunger, completed rifles going directly from factory floor to frontline trenches blocks away. Stalingrad in 1942-1943 represented urban warfare at its most brutal and intimate. In the ruined city on the Volga, the Mosin Nagant's length became both advantage and disadvantage. In the rubble of collapsed buildings, Soviet soldiers found the rifle unwieldy in close quarters. But at medium range, shooting across streets or from building to building, the Mosin's power and accuracy were devastating. German soldiers interviewed after Stalingrad described the constant terror of Soviet snipers armed with scoped Mosin Nagant rifles. A German helmet offered no protection against a 7.62 x54 round at 300 meters. Neither did sandbags, wooden barricades, or the brick walls of Stalingrad's ruined buildings. Soviet snipers made the daylight hours a death sentence for exposed German soldiers. The sniper variant of the Mosin Nagant, fitted with a PU or PE scope, became the most feared weapon in the German soldiers' nightmares. Soviet snipers like Vasily Zaitsev at Stalingrad used Mosin rifles to kill over 200 German soldiers. Lyudmila Pavlichenko, the deadliest female sniper in history, credited 309 kills to her Mosin Nagant. These weren't just numbers. They were German officers, NCOs, machine gunners, the experienced soldiers that held units together. The rifle's power meant Soviet snipers could reliably kill at distances exceeding 800 meters. At such ranges, German soldiers often didn't hear the shot that killed them. They would simply collapse, dead before the sound arrived. This psychological impact was as important as the physical casualties. German infantry learned to fear any movement in daylight, any position without hard cover, any moment of inattention. By 1943, Soviet industry had recovered from the initial German onslaught. Factories evacuated east of the Urals operated at full capacity, producing Mosin Nagant rifles faster than Germany could produce Kar 98Ks. The Soviet Union was winning the production war, and the Mosin was at the heart of that victory. At the Battle of Kursk in July 1943, the largest tank battle in history, infantry armed with Mosins played a crucial role that tank-focused histories often overlook. While T-34s clashed with Tigers and Panthers, Soviet infantry held defensive lines with concentrated rifle fire. German infantry attacks, necessary to support armor advances, met walls of bullets from dug-in Soviet riflemen. According to tactical studies of the battle, Soviet infantry doctrine at Kursk emphasized overlapping fields of fire, creating kill zones where multiple riflemen could engage any German soldier simultaneously. The Mosin's accuracy and power made this tactic devastatingly effective. German casualties from small arms fire during infantry assaults were significantly higher than expected. As the Red Army began its great westward offensive in 1943-1944, millions of soldiers carried their Mosins into Poland, Romania, Hungary, and finally Germany itself. The rifle that had defended Moscow and Leningrad now became the weapon of Soviet vengeance. Soviet soldiers carried Mosins through the gates of Auschwitz when they liberated the death camp in January 1945. They carried them through the streets of Budapest, Warsaw, and Vienna. In April 1945, Soviet infantry fought through the ruins of Berlin, the Mosin Nagant, present at the end as it had been at the beginning. Soviet soldiers raised their rifles in victory atop the Reichstag, the building Hitler had used to consolidate his power now conquered by men with weapons older than the Nazi Party itself. Victory over Nazi Germany didn't end the Mosin Nagant's service. The Cold War created new conflicts, new wars, and the Soviet Union exported millions of Mosins to communist allies and revolutionary movements worldwide. The rifle that had defeated Hitler would now arm struggles across the globe. During the Korean War from 1950 to 1953, Chinese and North Korean forces carried Mosin Nagant rifles against American and UN troops, armed with M1 Garands and M1 carbines. The Americans had semi-automatic rifles with superior rates of fire. They had better logistics, better training, better everything except numbers and determination. Chinese infantry, many carrying Mosins, achieved tactical victories through mass assaults that overwhelmed American positions despite inferior weapons. In Vietnam, Viet Cong fighters and North Vietnamese Army soldiers used Mosin Nagant rifles, particularly sniper variants, throughout the conflict. While the AK-47 became the symbol of the Vietnam War, Mosin sniper rifles remained valued for their accuracy and power. American soldiers in the Central Highlands learned to fear the distinctive crack of a Mosin at distance, a sound that often preceded the death of a point man or officer. Soviet client states in Africa, the Middle East, and Latin America received millions of Mosin Nagant rifles through the Cold War decades. Revolutionary movements from Cuba to Angola to Afghanistan armed themselves with rifles that had defeated the Wehrmacht. The weapon's simplicity and durability made it ideal for guerrilla forces operating in harsh conditions with minimal support. Today, over 130 years after its introduction, the Mosin Nagant remains in service with military and paramilitary forces worldwide. It has appeared in conflicts in Syria, Ukraine, Yemen, and throughout Africa. No other rifle design has served so long, in so many conflicts, across so many continents. The rifle's influence extends beyond its direct military service. The 7.62x 54mm cartridge it fires remains one of the longest-serving military cartridges in history, still standard in Russian machine guns and sniper rifles. Modern Russian weapons trace their lineage through the Mosin Nagant, carrying forward the design philosophy that prioritized reliability over refinement, function over form. Western collectors and shooters have discovered the Mosin Nagant in recent decades, surplus rifles imported by the millions. They find the same qualities Soviet soldiers valued: brutal reliability, adequate accuracy, and power that demands respect. The rifle costs less than almost any other military surplus weapon, yet it delivers performance that exceeds its price by orders of magnitude. Military historians studying the Eastern Front have reassessed the Mosin Nagant's role in World War II. For decades, Western scholarship emphasized German technological superiority, treating the Soviet victory as a triumph of numbers over quality. Recent scholarship tells a different story. The Mosin wasn't inferior, it was optimized for a different kind of war, and in that war, it proved superior to German weapons in the ways that mattered most. The rifle succeeded not despite its crude design, but because of it. Loose tolerances meant it worked in conditions that stopped more refined weapons. Heavy weight meant soldiers could fire it accurately despite minimal training. Its power meant it remained effective at ranges where modern assault rifles struggle. Simple construction meant it could be produced in quantities that overwhelmed Germany's more sophisticated but lower output manufacturing. Over 37 million Mosin Nagant rifles were manufactured between 1891 and 1965. No exact count exists of how many soldiers carried them, how many battles they fought in, how many lives they took or saved. The rifle was present at the fall of the Russian Empire, the birth of the Soviet Union, the defeat of Nazi Germany, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and countless smaller conflicts that history barely remembers. It killed German soldiers in the snow outside Moscow. It killed American soldiers in the rice paddies of Vietnam. It killed in the service of empires and revolutions, dictatorships and liberation movements, causes noble and causes horrific. The rifle itself was indifferent to the hands that held it, the ideology that deployed it, the reasons men gave for the killing it enabled. Veterans of the Eastern Front, Russian and German alike, speak of the Mosin with a mixture of respect and horror. German soldiers remember the sound it made, that distinctive crack echoing across frozen fields before their comrades fell. Soviet veterans remember its weight on long marches, its recoil against their shoulders, the way it became an extension of their bodies through months and years of war. The Mosin Nagant won World War II not alone, but as an essential element in Soviet victory. Without it, Soviet infantry couldn't have held at Moscow, couldn't have endured Stalingrad, couldn't have driven west to Berlin. It wasn't the T-34 tank or the Katyusha rocket that broke the Wehrmacht. It was millions of Soviet soldiers with rifles that simply refused to stop working. In the end, the Mosin Nagant is more than a rifle. It is a monument to brutal practicality, to the truth that war is won not by the best weapons, but by weapons good enough, produced in quantities that matter, wielded by soldiers determined to prevail regardless of cost. It is a reminder that technological superiority means nothing if your superior weapons freeze in winter while your enemy's crude rifle keeps firing. The German army had better rifles, better tanks, better aircraft, better everything except the will to endure what the Soviet people endured. They had precision where the Soviets had determination. They had quality where the Soviets had quantity. They had sophistication where the Soviets had simplicity. And they lost. The Mosin Nagant crushed Hitler's army not through elegance but through persistence, not through innovation, but through sheer relentless presence on every battlefield, in every soldier's hands, working when nothing else would. It was the rifle equivalent of the Soviet Union itself, crude, heavy, brutal, and ultimately unstoppable. Today, rusted Mosins lie in the forests outside Moscow, where they fell in 1941. They rest in mass graves at Stalingrad, in rubble at Berlin, in jungles across Southeast Asia. Others hang on walls as relics, fire at shooting ranges as curiosities, or serve still in hands of soldiers who've never known another weapon. The rifle endures, as it always has, indifferent to history's judgment. And somewhere, in some forgotten corner of some distant conflict, a Mosin Nagant is being loaded, aimed, and fired. The rifle that refused to die continues its century-long vigil. Its legacy isn't written in technical specifications or museum plaques. It's written in the survival of nations and the graves of millions. It's carved into the history of the 20th century with the same brutal simplicity that defined its design. The Mosin Nagant didn't crush Hitler's army because it was the best rifle ever made. It crushed Hitler's army because when everything else failed, when the world burned and civilization collapsed into barbarism, this old rifle from 1891 simply kept working. And in the end, that was enough.